So a couple of weeks ago, my wife was off on a nice trip to Chefchaouen and some Tetuan and some areas in Morocco, and I was left with my son, and so I decided to play The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, and it was an incredible game. I don't get to play video games near as often as I used to, and it was a remarkable experience. The next opportunity I have a lot of spare time and the money, I'm definitely going to buy the previous games and kind of play through again. I'm reading the books, and also while I was playing the game, I enjoyed it so much, I watched the series. And so there's been a lot of videos online talking about the casting in the Witcher Netflix series. And I think that some of the criticisms are legitimate and other ones are perhaps illegitimate in the sense that I think people fall in love with the game's portrayals and they misconstrue the way the game is portrayed with that being somehow more authentic, it's really about storytelling. Can it be true to the source material in such that it doesn't take away from the authorial intent? And I think that actually they did a pretty good job in the casting overall in the Netflix series of maybe bringing in some different ethnic groups, but doing so in such a way that doesn't really break world building, with one notable exception. I want to talk about that in a moment. But I think that the actress they picked for Yennifer, even though I think she's maybe half Indian, she's a British actress, I think she did a perfectly fine job. Physically, I don't think there's anything about her that stands out so vastly different from the way she's portrayed in the book to be an issue as far as the interpretation of the author. And then as far as Triss is concerned, I guess my main issue, not necessarily with a performance, I think all of the performances were pretty good. I think my only real gripe with performances is perhaps with Dandelion and the sort of modernization of the music that he's playing, and there's sort of a fourth wall breaking aspect there that I kind of take issue with. But as far as the actress that played Triss, there was really not much of an issue there other than the book sort of explains that, and those stories explain as well too, that the sorceresses sort of get to enhance their physical appearance, that being seductive figures is part of the court politics that takes place in being a sorceress. And the way that they portrayed Triss, she just did not come across as a figure capable of seduction. And so that might have been more an issue with costuming or makeup. It's not necessarily an issue that the actress herself couldn't be more seductive in appearance. I'm not going to say that in particular. However, I will say that it missed that element. Whereas in the actress played Yennefer, they obviously made her this powerful, seductive figure. And even if maybe physically she wasn't an exact depiction of the book, I think she was close enough. And I have no objections to her performance, in such a way that I would say that that was a miss. So where is my primary objection? And this is probably my criticism of a lot of modern casting, where Hollywood wants to include more minorities. And when I say minorities, I mean minorities in America. A lot of times these population groups are not actually white people are the general overall minority when you're talking ethnic groups as far as the global population is concerned. With the two actresses being Triss and Yennefer both, I think, being half Indian, there's a lot more Indian people in the world. There's over 1 billion, so when we're talking minorities, we're talking about American minorities. But they have this noble goal, which is to try to make their shows more diverse. However, they continue to pick source material that is telling European or Northern European stories. And so you're picking source material that's all geographically from particular regions where one ethnic group is by far the majority. But then you want to substitute different ethnic groups. And for the most part, they did okay because, for example, with the sorceresses and the magicians, it's perfectly acceptable within a fantasy tale to believe that you have all these sorcerers and magicians coming from all different parts of the world because they're a rare breed. They're special because they're magical. And so that means that they're probably going to travel a lot more. They can teleport, for Pete's sake. And so it's perfectly acceptable that perhaps the magicians and sorcerers are far more ethnically diverse than the local population. I have no objection to that, and I think that was a particularly wise place to maybe make substitutions as far as changing the ethnicity of a character. Where I think it becomes an issue is actually with the world building itself. And so I have one main observation, because I think it's a subtle one, but I think it resonates in the back of people's heads without realizing it. And so I noticed when The Witcher was in Blaviken, that occasionally they would have background characters that are of African descent. And and then so there's, okay, why in the town of Blaviken, this sort of European-esque podunk town, do you have just this minority group that stands out so vastly different than the rest of the population there? And why does that stand out? Well, that's because in ancient times, diversity was not common. You need something, sweetheart? So what is my primary critique with The Witcher Netflix adaptation and how they substitute ethnicity? And it's actually with the background characters, it's with the extras that I noticed this is the issue with world building. And why that is because it makes sense in the modern time where you will find cities that are highly diverse. And that is because immigrating from one place to another in the modern era is very easy. You can get on a boat, you can get on a plane, and within a matter of hours, you can be any place in the world. And so that's why nowadays you'll find many cities that are highly diverse. If you go to Los Angeles, if you go to New York, if you go to London, if you go to Paris. And this is not the case historically. You have very few major super cities in which there are highly diverse different ethnic groups present from vastly different geographic regions. Rome, Babylon, Constantinople perhaps, maybe in Egypt. You might have had some places where it's financially worthwhile to make a significant dangerous, difficult trek where that's financially advantageous. And since it was difficult to travel in the ancient era, you didn't do it unless you had to. And so people did not immigrate vast differences often. And so what that meant was that unless it was this rare, large city that had a financial reason for people to travel large distances, the people there would be genetically within that geographic region for a significant manner of time. So let's say, for example, in Blaviken, where I'm seeing these extras and you're seeing people who look of European descent and then suddenly someone who looks like they're from a sub-Saharan African descent. In the storytelling, if somebody had made that long journey from one continent to another, they didn't do it quickly or often. So chances are if someone moved there, over time they would intermingle with the population through marriage and their children, so on and so forth. So if they're only a small number, they would generally blend into the larger majority of that area genetically. And so you wouldn't see someone with significantly a different tone of skin from the other people. You can even see this take place over 4 or 5 generations. In the United States, you can oftentimes notice that if you were to stand someone in the United States who is of African origin next to someone who is a recent immigrant from Africa, you can often see differences. Not always the case. Of course, we're talking generalities and populations. But most of the time, you can tell the difference between an African American and someone who's recently immigrated from Somalia or Eritrea. And that's because over the course of time, populations intermingle. And so those genetic attributes that might stand out begin to blend in towards the larger majority population. So in Blaviken, it would be unlikely to have a bunch of very pale Europeans next to people who look like they're from sub-Saharan Africa. And chances are, if you had someone immigrate in, they would eventually intermingle the population, and so you might have some people who have some of those attributes, but whose the melanin in their skin would have become more tan as a paler person has a child with someone who has a darker melanin, and those sort of blend in. Just like my own children picked up my wife's Hispanic skin, her Mexican native, skin that has the ability to tan, where my skin has no ability to tan, and so these attributes intermingle. And so that's perhaps my main critique, is that it just does not make for authentic world building. Now, does that mean that I don't want different ethnic groups present in my storytelling? Absolutely not. But it does mean that if you want particular ethnicities to be present in, say, these particular tales, you should tell stories from those regions. You can't constantly pick stories from Northern Europe or fantasy tales based around sort of imaginary European locations and then just substitute willy-nilly different ethnicities. You have to have the courage to tell stories from different places or imagine different places. Game of Thrones is actually a great example of getting around that, because there's different continents present in the story, and so you have logical reasons why you have a genetic diversity that takes place, because we acquire these attributes over the course of time because they are advantageous to particular topographies, or the sun that's in the sky. I live here in Morocco now, and so the sun can be quite overbearing. If I just go outside all of the time, my skin is going to receive significant damage for that, which is eventually would lead to some sort of skin cancer. And so it makes sense that over the course of time, our bodies begin to develop natural adaptations to the environment we're in. And so in Blaviken, it just simply does not make sense with the way travel works for just the regular townsperson, for you to have this highly genetically diverse population. Chances are everybody would probably come from that region, and every so often somebody who immigrates in from far away would eventually blend into the population through childbearing in that generation, and then their kids have kids, and so on and so forth. And so essentially this critique comes down simply to world building and coming up with good reasons why you make substitutions. And for example, even Shakespeare did this very intelligently when he wrote Othello. He didn't just simply make Othello a black Italian. He was a Moor, right? Moors was a whole empire in Africa that expanded up through Europe. Even about half of Spain was under Moorish conquest. You have Andalusia and such. And so it makes total sense for Othello to be there because he is a Moor. So they just don't, Shakespeare just doesn't make him black without an explanation. He has a perfectly logical explanation for, number one, why Othello's there, and number one, why he looks the way he does, because he is a Moor. And so you simply have to find explanations where it's logical, such as the place of sorcerers and magicians, and where it's not logical, you have to in my opinion, choose the right choice for the particular world building. And if you want more of one particular if different ethnicities to be present, then have the courage to tell different stories where that world has more of that ethnicity present. And I highly encourage that, and I think that's the direction Netflix should go, and that we should support them in that effort rather than just changing for the sake of changing, and not recognizing that's going to have some impact on the authenticity of the storytelling. So that's my criticism. Hope you find it valid. If you don't find it valid for whatever reason, write a comment, and hopefully this was enjoyable, or at least worth your wasting time. All right.